So we're gonna push in a little bit more stuff. We've got a lot to cover today. So let's first talk a little bit about succeeding in group projects, or really why group projects are a good fit for makerspaces in general. Um, so group work is a good strategy for working with students in makerspaces because of like the practical reasons. If you have one 3D printer and a bunch of kids, group work is really a good strategy to kind of make that work. Also reduces the bottleneck at machines. If every single person in your class is cutting something or printing something, you know what backup that's going to be. It reduces the print cutting time. And also what's really nice about group work in the makerspace is these projects that go on beyond just one class. When you have a group that's continuing that project work, the kids that are absent and come back, there's a continuum, so there at least some students in the group are usually able to catch that kid up, and you as a teacher aren't kind of going back a few days to wherever that kid was there before to get them caught up with their individual work. So those are the some of the practical reasons to use group work in makerspaces. But then group work is also a very great opportunity in makerspaces for different types of learning. In particular, it's supportive of PBL. Really working in a PBL group and in a makerspace is a really powerful combination, which we've talked about before. And then sociocultural learning is a learning theory or a pedagogy that describes how students learn from each other and from mentors and from social interactions. And group work is a really great place to put that theory into practice, where they are all learning from each other, learning from other groups, and learning from mentors in the space. It also provides opportunities for inquiry-driven work, where each person in the group can kind of find their inquiry lines of inquiry and maybe start to answer questions that they're interested in the group work. It also is a really great opportunity to develop those dispositions and skills that we talked about a little bit, I think, in module one. Those what we might call 21st century skills or soft skills or sometimes STEM competencies, and the dispositions that come with those. So the skills like good communication, and then the dispositions like creativity and perseverance, those types of things. So group work is an excellent place for students to work on those skills and those dispositions. You really can't find those in individual work in the lab. And then the other thing is it gives the opportunity for real world relevance. Of course, when kids are working on group projects, it's easy to add in that real world problem solving. And additionally, it's, in the real world, out in the workplace, people work in groups. So really having that opportunity for students to start doing that in school and in the makerspace is a great combination. Now, you can't just suddenly start doing group work in your class if you haven't kind of set up some expectations for your class. There's a successful classrooms have a culture that supports group work. And so working on that culture from day one in your class is pretty important. And here are some and the culture that we're look that makes group work really work is a feeling of safety from the kids and trust within each other, and a really clear understanding of how they should be behaving in group work. So making those things really clear to your students and talking about them in those very same terms, about how they're expected to work. But some things that you can do as a teacher to kind of build up that classroom culture of making group work is to integrate team building activities pretty regularly. Some icebreakers or some different ways for them to get together that aren't necessarily tied to their group assignment yet. So this is kind of pre group work. Develop class norms. So how do we treat each other and how do we respect each other, and what are our kind of rules of the class? And that is a very powerful activity if it's done with the class and asking the students for their input on how should we treat each other in the class. Let's write this down and keep it on the board for the rest of the year. And that way you can always refer to that board when groups are kind of flailing or getting at each other. You can refer to the class norms that you've developed, like, we'll take our turns listening, and we'll practice active listening, and um, we'll make our part, we'll do our part, and we'll throw our things away, and all those types of things that your students have already decided are important in the class in general. They're also very important group work. So modeling group work behavior as a facilitator, as a teacher is very helpful. How do you actively listen to students? How do you facilitate a group discussion in your classroom so that every student feels like they have a voice? If you're a good facilitator in group discussions, that's a really great modeling behavior for how they can kind of facilitate during group work. And you can point that out too as a facilitator. And then another really good opportunity to kind of build up that culture in your classroom is to offer small um, bite-sized group work practice, as I like to call it, like a think, pair, share activity is something you can just add to your lecture or your assignment. And the kids practice pairing together, thinking about the challenge, pairing together, and then talking to each other about it. That's a really good way to practice those soft skills that they're going to need during group work. Another kind of really easy thing to implement in your class is when they're working on individual work. And you're facilitating or walking around the room and people start asking you questions that really suck up your time, you can install the expectation that I call ask three then me. And that means the student, before they ask you the question about why their Scratch program isn't working or whatever is happening on their screen, they ask three other students first, and then if they don't get the answer from one student and then the next, then they can ask you as a facilitator. It really does start to build expertise among your students and trust among your students, and a way for it also frees up you as a teacher to kind of answer those harder questions rather than those questions that their friend right next to them has already figured out. So it's a really easy way to implement that mindset and build that culture in your classroom without really taking anything away from you as a teacher. Those two things are real easy add-ons. The other thing that I didn't put on is quick formative check-ins or reflections. Raising their hand is a good way of formative feedback, but also, rather than just raising your hand, asking your students if they agree or if they disagree or if they're kind of in the middle. So just different ways of using your hand for formative feedback. I also do the 5-finger feedback. Who's excited to work on this project? 5 fingers for very excited, 1 project for not so excited, and then like the middle, maybe kind of excited. So different ways of practicing those things as a teacher. It doesn't make your lesson plans any more complicated to write or do, but it just adds that extra component of they start relying on each other and getting feedback from each other rather than always and only just getting feedback from the teacher. So those are some tips and tricks for helping successful group work. You as teachers probably have a lot more in your back pocket that you've done. They I have more tips on the other one. That one was what we were talking about, building classroom culture. So tips about the group work itself, which again, I feel like you as teachers are probably pretty invested in this work, especially if you're working in Makerspace, you're already doing group work, I'm sure. Is consider the group size, will everyone have something to do? What is the too small of a group? What is too big of a group for this particular project? Thoughtful groupings, are we grouping students by friend groups, or are we grouping them by their zone of proximal development, where they land kind of in the content area? How are you actually going to group these kids together, and how will that work? So thinking about that, setting clear objectives for the group, of course, is very important from the very beginning. And that means sharing the assessment if it's a rubric or if it's a presentation or whatever the assessment is early, and coming back to it with the group, because that really should kind of set the pace for how the group works together, and they all have a shared understanding of how this is going to end. Um, Consider self or peer assessment in group work. I know that there are some teachers that do kind of um, either peer assessment within a group where the group people individually kind of assess members in the group. So whatever works for you, really depending, of course, on the age of your students, but also on the culture that you've set up in your classroom. Peer assessment can be a very positive tool that can really help the teacher understand where the kids are. But it can also be a very challenging for groups that aren't ready to kind of take that step to evaluate their peers in a way. So if your class culture isn't quite ready for that, assessing peers, maybe it's something to think about where they are. And then as integrating reflective opportunities within the group. Again, if you kind of set this up in your classroom where we think about what we're learning and then we talk about it, and you start doing it in the group, it's a really good way to bring out the learning that they're doing in those groups. So these are some pretty general ways of making group work within your class, but very powerful as well. And it really brings that real world and real team feeling into your groups when they can do stuff like that.